Welcome to Roleplaying History, the podcast where we explore the history of role-playing games. I'm Wayne Davis, and I'll be your guide for today's tour. Episode 143, The Morrow Project and Heroic Fantasy. Before we get into today's show, I need to note that I've got an announcement about the future of both of our podcasts, and I'll get into that at the end of today's show. Don't worry, we're not going away. We're just making a few changes. Like I said, I'll address all of that at the end of today's tour. So leaving that subject on the back burner for a bit, today's tour is going to be a bit like we've been doing for the past month. We'll be covering a tabletop role-playing game to start. Then we'll be picking a title off my play-by-mail list I've been working on for the past little while, and we'll drop some knowledge on you. And believe me, we've got some knowledge to drop on you for both of today's subjects. That means I need to stop blabbering on, get the tour bus cranked up, and get to today's first topic. The Morrow Project is a science fiction role-playing game created by Kevin Dockery, Robert Sadler, and Richard Toloka, and published by Timeline Limited. But you know me, we've got to dive a bit deeper to give you the whole story before we break down how the game works. The beginnings of the Morrow Project go back to 1974 when Robert Sadler wrote an outline for a post-apocalyptic adventure story. Richard Toloka then added a second chapter to that story, but the project was buried shortly after and stayed buried for well over a year. At some point in 1975, the two were introduced to role-playing, and it was shortly after that Toloka realized that the Morrow Project could be used as an adventure background for a role-playing game. So he used Sadler's story as a background to write that game background. He and Sadler then joined up with Kevin Dockery to work on the military portion of that game. Once they'd worked up a game, well, it was time to play test. They'd wind up spending months doing that, and they brought it to an early Michicon to run it, and it was a hit. Timeline Games was born shortly after that, and that was the publisher used to release the first edition of the game in 1980. Shortly after the release, internal conflict within the company caused Toloka and Sadler to leave and create Tacky Tack Games, which would later become TriTac Games. However, they didn't get to take the Morrow Project with them. Timeline would continue to publish new editions of the game, with the second edition being released later in 1980 and third edition in 1983. Looking at various supplemental releases from Timeline Limited, there were 7 supplements and 8 adventures released between 1980 and 1987. And it should be noted that there was a very loyal crowd of players of the game, but after 1987, no new materials were published for the game. Now, why is that? Well, due to financial issues, at some point after 1987, Timeline Limited went out of business. Now, I'd like to be able to give you an exact year, but despite my best efforts to root through the interwebs, I wasn't able to dig one up. So by the end of the 1980s, if you didn't have your Morrow Project game materials, you either needed to have access to a used game shop or you were shit out of luck. That is until late 2012. At that time, Christopher Morrow and Robert O'Connor announced that they were producing a 4th edition of the Morrow Project. They were using a Kickstarter to fund the project, and they set a $15,000 goal. By January of 2013, they'd more than doubled that goal, and they released the 4th edition on December 15th of 2013. By the way, if you're looking to pick up a copy of that edition, you can pick it up at timelineltd.com. Yeah, Timeline Ltd. sold its intellectual property to a third party, and they've gone digital. The website's not very fancy, and you've got to leave your email address to get a response, but if you're interested, give them a shot. All right, so we've got the history lesson covered. Let's check out the setting and how the game's played, since we've talked about a lot of post-apocalyptic games on this show over the past couple of years. The basic idea of the game is that a group of American industrialists predicted the coming of an apocalyptic nuclear war and thus began to create a plan for an emergency operations and reconstruction infrastructure that would be able to survive the war when it happened. That plan is what is known as the Morrow Project. And here's how it works. A number of volunteers were cryogenically frozen in hidden bunkers called bolt holes. They were provided with substantial caches of supplies and equipment intended to help the teams rebuild civilization, since it was believed that once the war had ended, some places would be identified where the hazards like nuclear fallout would have sufficiently diminished so as to allow for human resettlement. The plan was for the Morrow Project to be coordinated by a central command post and record-keeping facility called the Prime Base. That is an immense self-contained bunker with various annexes hidden underground in Nevada in the canyons near Soldier Meadow. Its details are explained in the gamebook Prime Base. The facility's advanced life support systems and huge variety of other equipment were intended to allow the project's leaders not to sleep through the war so as to chronicle it and be in the best position to determine what should be done next. The project's Phoenix team, which is a very secret Tier 1 special ops unit of roughly platoon strength, was also there, but kept in suspended animation to be used only on the highest authority if there was no alternative. Now, Prime Base was built in isolation, according to schedule, but just before it could assume its role, it was sabotaged and bombed by a shadowy madman called Krell, and it sustained a lot of serious damage. The sudden attack wiped out the Morrow Project leaders. But 150 years after the war, the damaged central computer at Prime Base finally began to issue one or more wake-up signals. This revived at least one of the Morrow Project assets, which would be the team that the PCs are a part of. The status of other teams is intentionally kept unclear, which means that those details can be worked out by the game master, which in this game is known as the project director. So the game centers around the question of whether the project is hopelessly compromised or whether its scattered outposts can reconnect and replace the non-functional headquarters. Must they try to confront huge reconstruction tasks alone when it was expected that thousands of project members would help them? Do they have the courage to try? Well, let's talk about kicking off gameplay. When playing the initial scenario, it can be played with just the gamebook, dice, paper, and pencils. As I noted a couple of moments ago, and I'll get into more details in a few more moments, there are expansion sets available that were available to introduce future scenarios, weapons, and equipment. Now, before we move along, I need to mention why I'm not getting into character creation in this show. Two reasons. First is that I wasn't actually able to get a copy of the game books and instead had to rely on various fan sites online to dig up the information I've got, which means that rather than character creation, I've got details on what the game was about rather than how characters were created. Second is that while I was able to learn what the game system was, which was the timeline system, I've been completely unable to learn a damn thing about what that system was. I'm still checking the interwebs to see if I can find anything about it, and if I can dig up anything usable, I promise you I will put it in a future episode. So, no character creation stuff in this show, and I apologize for that. That being said, let's continue on the scenario stuff. The initial scenario picks up 150 years after the Third World War. The members of the Morrow Project awaken to find themselves in a very strange world. Instead of being part of the organized plan to rebuild civilization, which is what they expected to find, they're isolated in a strange world where the war is nothing but a distant legend. The people are ignorant of anything but the struggle to survive, and strange mutated animals haunt their footsteps. Players in the Morrow Project have to not only survive, but they're forced to carry out their original mission, which is to rebuild the world. So to do this, they have to use their equipment and training, which they have. They also have to use their team and their guts and their imagination. Working with their teammates, they've got to do the job that thousands were trained to do. So, good luck with that. Included in the base game book were extensive details on the teams, vehicles, weapons, other equipment, medical details, dangers from nuclear weapon effects, and any other information the project director would need vis-a-vis the Morrow project. And until the 4th edition, there were detailed information on which locations in the United States had been hit by Soviet ICBMs, which of the enemy MIRVs, MIRVSs, hadn't detonated, and which had struck targets other than those intended. And why don't those show up in the 4th edition? That goes back to the very real-world history of the 1980s, and if you don't know that, I'd very strongly suggest that at the very least, you drop the words Cold War into Wikipedia and do a quick read. I mean, that's just a quick starting point. There's a whole hell of a lot more I'd really suggest reading, but this is a role-playing game show, not a world history podcast. With that, let's do a little team breakdown, since if we can't do character creation, we can at least lay out some stuff to explain some hows and whys. One thing we need to understand is that while all of the teams are equipped to survive on their own, there was no way to equip every team for every contingency. So while you've got some recon teams that are equipped as heavily as a modern-day Navy SEAL team, you've got others that aren't. And another thing to understand is that you've got teams that were placed in their sleep cycles in various times from the 1960s on, which means that their gear will vary. Think the difference between field gear an Army platoon would have had during the Vietnam War and what a platoon would have today. So let's take a closer look at the various project groups. Recon groups are the most numerous groups of the project. They are the general purpose groups of the project. They're equipped with varying types of weapons and equipment ranging from V-150 armored cars to SK-5 hovercraft. Their orders are to reconnoiter the countryside, report on local conditions, and provide advice to Prime Base concerning which teams should be awakened next. MARS are the teams that make up the military arm of the project. MARS stands for Mobile Assault, Rescue, and Strike. These guys are extremely formidable and heavily armed. Now, they've got conventional weapons, but some of the groups also have man-portable laser weapons. Some also have early generation minimalist powered armor. The overall purpose of the Mars teams is to support and defend civilians and the other project teams. And, as one would expect, a large portion of the Mars members are ex-military with combat experience. Some Mars teams have heavy vehicles, such as the Mars 1, which is a large, custom-built, articulated vehicle with very heavy armor and powerful weapons. It can carry troops, employ onboard sensors, provide early warning, and serve as a command post. Science teams. These are cross-trained scientific and technical units that are trained to handle a wide range of situations, from complex medical care and epidemiology to unusual hazards and dangerous creatures. These guys have a wide variety of knowledge, and I mean a wide variety of knowledge. Think biology to nuclear physics, and those are all on the same team, sometimes in the same brain. These teams have a custom-built articulated vehicle called the Science 1, and its armament is second only to the Mars team. Now, while these are the three main groups, there are a few very specialized groups that are frozen, just waiting to be awakened. They have a very specialized function that they're trained for, and they're waiting for their specific orders to be awakened. Let me give you a couple of examples. Engineering, agricultural, communications, aviation, I think you get the idea. These wouldn't be the groups you'd want out on a broad sort of watch. You'd be bringing them in to do specific things, so you'd keep them frozen until you're certain you need them. Then you'd wake them up to come in and do the job you need them to do. Now, I mentioned moments ago that there were several supplements and adventures that were published during the original run, and their rarity made me realize I should probably name them here for those of you who've got original copies, since I noticed while I was doing my research online that copies in decent condition can fetch a fair price. The Game Master's package Basic Vehicular Loads came out in 1980, as did the Morrow Project Vehicular Blueprints. Personal Basic Loads also came out in 1980. The Morrow Project Game Master's Shield and Reference Tables released in 1981, and the Security Cover Sheets followed that same year. 1983 brought the Personal and Vehicular Basic Loads and the Morrow Project Role-Playing Expansion. Later that year, we also got the Project Director's Shield. Insofar as adventures, 3 came out in 1982, Damocles, Liberation at Reverton, and Operation Lucifer. The Ruins of Chicago came out in 1983. The Starnaman Incident dropped in 1984, Operation Lone Star in 1985, Desert Search in 1986, and Prime Base in 1987. After that, as I said earlier, we didn't get anything else until the Kickstarter for 4th edition. So let's talk reviews. William A. Barton handled the review for the May 1981 edition of The Space Gamer and said that, quote, overall, I'd have to give the Morrow Project the highest of ratings as a science fiction role-playing system. If it isn't at least nominated for the Origins Award this year, there just ain't no justice in Gameland, end quote. For the record, it wasn't nominated, so I guess there ain't no justice in Gameland. Chris Bayless reviewed the game for the May 1983 issue of Imagine magazine and said, quote, my first impressions of the Morrow Project made me want to begin a game immediately. The idea seemed new and exciting, and the system looked advanced, well thought out, and imaginative, end quote. Look, I know there are a ton of post-apocalyptic games out there on the market, but the concepts that the Morrow Project was built on are solid and much more believable than a great majority of those that are on the market today, which tend to have a more futuristic twist to them. For my money, if you're looking for a more realistic feel to your post-apocalyptic game, the Morrow Project would be a good place to start. All right, I think we've covered the Morrow Project about as far as we can for today, so let's move on and dig into our other topic for today's show. Heroic Fantasy is a computer-moderated dungeon crawl play-by-mail game that's been active since 1982. Well, all right, that's the basics. Let's do the deep dive. Rick Loomis is the creator of Heroic Fantasy, and if you're a long-time listener of this show, you've heard that name before, and there's a reason for that. Loomis is considered to be one of the, if not the, founder of the play-by-mail industry through Flying Buffalo, Inc. In the early 1970s, he had a bunch of play-by-mail games going, and that's where we've discussed him in the past on this show. But we're not here to specifically talk about either Rick Loomis or Flying Buffalo. We're here to talk about Heroic Fantasy, so let's do that. As I mentioned, it was first made available for play in 1982, March of 1982 to be more specific. By November of that year, according to Rick Loomis himself, the game had over 400 players. And by the late 1980s, Flying Buffalo had switched the game over from human to computer moderation. For those who like getting into the minutia of details on this stuff, Heroic Fantasy was Flying Buffalo's third play-by-mail game, and when they made it available as a turn-based computer game, they put it on a commercial network called The Source. In the 1980s, players involved in the game worked their way through a 9-story maze, and by the 1990s, Flying Buffalo had programmed the next 2 editions using a slightly different rationale, and we'll take it from a Rick Loomis interview from the early 2000s. Quote, in the first 2 versions, we told the players there was going to be 9 levels to the game, and the object was to go through all 9 levels and exit. Players exiting from the 9th level would be given wall plaques as a prize. We never actually finished programming the lower levels because only a couple people ever got as far as the 6th level, and after 8 years, only half a dozen are playing in the 5th level. We decided that maybe 9 levels was too much, end quote. And speaking on the lethality of the 9-level version of the game, Loomis had commented in the Space Gamer magazine in June of 1982 and stated, quote, Chuck Gatos is the first person to have a character killed. 2 of his party members were killed while on scouting missions in the first turn of the game, end quote. So yeah, I'd say maybe 9 levels was a bit much. The company decided to reduce the number of dungeon levels to 4, with players then exiting the dungeon to adventure in an outside environment, with the idea to recruit an army, then locate a castle to invade. Loomis then discussed some of the changes to the game in a 1990 edition of Flying Buffalo Quarterly, noting that they'd introduced bows and crossbows so that players could shoot across rooms. They also introduced a store so that players could purchase items and revive deceased characters, though that would cost a rather hefty price. By 1991, they'd gotten the first 2 levels of the new dungeon up and running and were playtesting level 3 while programming level 4. Now, when we discussed Flying Buffalo Inc. back in their episode, I mentioned they were sold to Webbed Sphere back in 2021. When that happened, none of the play-by-mail games were sold. Those were transferred to a new company, Rick Loomis PBM Games. The company is run by Rick's sisters and their play-by-mail computer experts and continues to offer all of the play-by-mail games, including Heroic Fantasy. So if you're interested in trying the game, and I'll get into the gameplay to whet your appetite momentarily, the website is rickloomispbm, all one word, .com. In Heroic Fantasy, players lead a team of fantasy characters. When you begin, you choose a party of up to 15 characters using 100 points, which you can use to maximize the size of the party or choose a smaller party but make them stronger. As I always like to say, choices. Various options are available when choosing your characters, including races like dwarves, giants, fairies, leprechauns, and gremlins, and types like magic users or fighters. It should have been apparent from my breakdown of the history section, but there isn't really a final object of the game or way to win. The purpose of the game is to advance by negotiating challenging mazes, defeat monsters, and collect treasure and experience points. In the original version, various players online noted that the second level was exceptionally challenging, while level 3, which was located outdoors, had many new wanderers in it and some new spells. Once one hit level 4, they'd run into a bunch of undead. Level 5 would force players to deal with a lot of danger, regardless of whether they'd want to or not. Working through mazes, spells included some that those of us familiar with Dungeons & Dragons would understand: Blast, Sleep, and Fireball. There's also different types of treasures to find, including 4 types of potions: Healing, Strength, Poison, and Stygian, which added 10 to the character's constitution, regardless of its current value. You can also find things like elf cloaks, fairy rings, amulets, and other assorted items. Other players can be encountered in the mazes, naturally, since this is a play-by-mail game. Monsters controlled by the computer are also open to be encountered. Again, that's to be expected. NPCs are also to be expected and are also the most likely to be encountered. NPCs will be part of a clan when encountered, and how they're dealt with can and will have ramifications as the player moves along in the adventures. So what did the reviewers think? W.G. Armentrout handled the review for the November 1982 edition of the Space Gamer. Armentrout noted, quote, "Heroic Fantasy is a fun game of dungeon delving, and I can recommend it to anyone who enjoys the insides of underground mazes. There are a lot of options and a lot of player versus player interaction. The speech orders add a distinct role-playing dimension," end quote. A.D. Young had the honors in the October 1983 issue of White Dwarf and noted, quote, "Heroic Fantasy is an excellent game for beginners. It does not involve very much diplomacy, though it can if one runs into groups of other players, and the rescue party rule makes it a game you can enjoy for a long time," end quote. And Heroic Fantasy won the Origins Award for Best Play-by-Mail or Correspondence Game of 2011. So, if you're looking for a fantasy game to play by mail, especially if you don't have a tabletop group to play with, why not give Heroic Fantasy a shot? And with that, we've come to the end of today's tour. Next week, we'll check out Space Opera and Star Web. All right, so I mentioned at the start of the show today that we've got a few changes coming around for Bad GM Productions. More to the point, the podcasts. Like I said, we're not going away, so for those who like what we're doing, don't worry about that. We're just going to be making a few changes. So starting in 2 weeks, we're going to make a few changes to how we do these podcasts, and we're doing them because of some life things I've got going on. I've got some work and life things that are changing, and since I'm the only one doing the research, writing, recording, and editing, if I'm working a different shift at a different job, I got to make a few changes to make all of this work out, and so that's what's going on. So here's what we're going to do. Starting the week of March 18th, we're going to change our release day from a Friday to Sunday. That's not a big change, I know, but the extra couple of days is going to be a big thing for me. It's the second change that's going to be the big one. Starting that week, we are going to alternate this show with Bad GM's Campaign Build Along. That means you're going to be getting a role-playing history every other week, as I'm going to move from 2 podcasts per week to 1. I got to do that to lessen the load on myself based on the life and work changes so that I've got a bit of a balance. The advantage for you is that I'm not going to blow through topics quite as quick, so it's going to give me way more time to research, and it means you get way more information for each show, which means I'm not running way short on every episode, kind of like I'm doing this week. So like I said, we're not going to go away. I'm just doing what I have to do for my health and for my personal life to give me that work-life balance. And I got to tell you, it was not an easy decision for me to make, but I hope you understand why. I also hope that you take the advantage of the opportunity to check out Bad GM's Campaign Build Along. We've got 2 full seasons already in the archives, and I am working on the 3rd season as we go along. Like I said, I appreciate all the time you've given me so far. We're not going away. It's just going to be every other week for this show. Anyway, until we get back to this next week, I do please ask that you check out the Build Along. This week, we're going to be building out the 2nd level of our subterranean chambers. The idea is that we're going to give our adventuring party some experience before we get them out into the world, but who knows what else I've got in store for them. Bad GM's Campaign Build Along is available wherever you get your podcasts or from our website, badgmproductions.net. The theme music for Role-Playing History is Beyond New Horizons by Giole Fazzeri, and it's available from pixabay.com. Role-Playing History is a production of Bad GM Productions. We are all over social media, so check out the info box for this show or the website to see where you can follow us. Then follow us to keep up with announcements like the one I just made. Next week, we're checking out Space Opera and Starweb, and I'll admit it, I didn't know jack about either one of those until I started researching them, so I get to drop some new knowledge on you. Until then, I'm Wayne Davis, and your Role-Playing History.